Good afternoon. We're going to get started. My name is Deborah Gonzalez, and I'm the Government Affairs Director at PPIC, the Public Policy Institute of California. For those of you who don't know about us, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank with offices both in Sacramento and San Francisco. Today's event is part of the James Irvine Foundation Briefing Series, and we'd like to thank them for this briefing and, again, the wonderful lunch that we have. For today's program, we're going to hear from PPI researcher Iwunze Ugo, who will present key findings for the new report that looks at data from California's new standardized tests and the progress that students are making, particularly economically disadvantaged students and English learners. Iwunze's co-author Laura Hill is here as well today and will be available later if you have any questions. You should have received a copy of the report, Student Achievement and Growth on the California K-12 Assessments at registration, and it's also available online. The slides also that you'll be seeing today will also be available online after at ppic.org. We'd very much like to thank Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund for their support of this work. After our presentation, we will have plenty of time for audience questions and answers. A few more things today. You'll get a survey, which as you all know, and we really appreciate if you fill out that survey because we make adjustments to our program based on that. And I'd like to mention an upcoming event that we're having. In 2 weeks from today, on May 11th, at the Sheraton, we'll have an event featuring business leader and philanthropist Tom Steyer. This event is close to being full, so if you want to come to this event, you'll need to quickly go and register. Don't leave here yet, because this is a really important presentation. But if you're not able to register online, we actually will have it available via webcast. And finally, please turn off your phones. In the last few years, California K-12 education system has undergone significant changes. There's been a shift in new standards, a new system of funding schools, and an overhaul of the testing and accountability system. And to understand how recent some of these changes are, I wanted to share with you that the new accountability system just rolled out a couple months ago. It's only the second year of the testing system, and it's only the fourth year of the funding system. All of these changes were made to improve student performance, particularly students from disadvantaged communities, as well as English learners. This report is an important step in trying to understand whether these reforms are making a difference. There's much about the report that I think you could spend a lot of time. I actually annoyed my husband greatly last night in going through the report at dinner, which I don't recommend. But I'm particularly excited about the report's efforts to take the test scores and look at the backdrop of the accountability system, the infamous blue, green, yellow, red, orange model. So for that, I really thank you. I suspect that because the accountability system is so new, this is one of the first reports that's tried to marry the two measurements. So with that, I'd like to bring Iwunze up here and good luck.
All right, hi everyone. My name is Iwunze Ugo. I'm a research associate at PPIC. Today I'll be talking about our new report, Student Achievement and Growth on California's K-12 Assessments. Thank you, Deborah, for the great introduction. I also want to thank my co-author, Laura Hill, and everyone at PPIC who helped put this report together. Also, I want to thank the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund for making this report possible. So Deborah talked about a lot of the major reforms that California has gone through in the last few years. We have the new funding system, the new testing and accountability system, and they're all focused on the goal of both preparing students for a changing future and closing achievement gaps for students that have historically underperformed. With the second year results, we can get a better sense of how students are doing in the wake of these new reforms. We can look at achievement, or the share of students meeting the standard, to get a sense of how students are doing overall or on average. And we can look at growth, which is a closer look at individual student scores to see how all students are improving. The state's measure combines these two important measures in order to take account of both important measures. And with an eye towards closing achievement gaps, We'll also look at the results for high-need students, both how these high-need students did overall and how districts with high shares of high-need students did relative to other districts with similar student demographics. So more formally, here's a bit of an outline of how today's presentation is going to go. First, I'm going to talk about achievement, which is the share of students meeting the standard, to get a sense of how students are doing now. Then we'll move to talking about growth, looking at individual student scores and how those scores have improved in the second year of testing. Then we'll review the state's new accountability measure and see how those results, which combine achievement and growth, vary across different districts. And finally, I'll close with some notes about important issues that arise from these results that will be important as we go forward with the state's new educational system. First, I want to take some time, I want to point out that while looking at the state's tests are very important, they're a very useful metric of how students are doing. The state's new accountability system takes into account multiple measures, everything from graduation and suspension rates to English learner progress and college and career readiness, in order to get a more broader picture of how students are doing overall in this new educational system. Going back to the overall state results, we see that overall, California students did much better on the second year of Smarter Balance tests than they did on the first year. Almost half of students met the standard in English, about 49% of students met the standard, which was up by about 10 percentage points from the year before. The scores were a bit lower in math, about 37% of students met the standard in math. We see that achievement increased at every grade level, with some grades doing very well relative to other grades. We saw 11th graders do quite well on the English tests, and third graders do very well on the math tests. So from now on, we're going to focus, rather than the results for all students, we'll be looking specifically at the results for fifth grade students in 2015-16 and comparing them to the results for fourth grade students in 2014-15. Now we do that in order to get a sort of cohort of students to see how a group of the same students have done in the first 2 years of these new tests. Now, we don't have individual level student data, so these aren't exactly the same students. Students can leave a school, a district, or even the state in any given year. However, looking at the fourth to fifth grade cohort is useful for a number of reasons. For one, students largely remain in the same schools and districts going from fourth to fifth grade. They're staying in elementary schools as opposed to some of the other grade levels where students are graduating to middle school or high school. Also, English learner students are often reclassified in these early grades. So as we look at these test results, it'll be important to get a look at how students are doing in these early years to see how English learner students are doing. So in our first look at these fifth grade results, we're looking at the results for the Smarter Balance tests in California and comparing it to the results from some 4 other large states that also use the Smarter Balance tests. Those 4 states are Michigan, Washington, Oregon, and Connecticut. We see that the other states did better than California on the first 2 years of the Smarter Balance tests, by about 10 percentage points. But going to the second year of Smarter Balance tests, California's fifth graders saw their achievement rise by much more than we saw in the other states, closing that gap in English from about 10 percentage points to 6 or 7. In math, both for California and for the other states, the scores for fourth graders actually fell as they went into fifth grade. The share of students meeting the standard was lower in the second year of the tests, both for California and for the other states. Although, again, California's scores, or the share of students meeting the standard in California, fell by less, again, tightening that gap. So California last switched to new tests and new standards back in 1998 with the shift to the California Standards Test, or CST. And as we compare the results from California's results on the first 2 years of the new test to California's results from the first 2 years of the old tests, we see that California students have done much better on these new tests. While achievement increased by almost 10 percentage points in English on the Smarter Balance tests in the first 2 years, in the first 2 years of the old test, the CST, achievement remained stagnant at about 36% of students meeting the standard, both in fourth grade in the first year and in fifth grade in the second year. Again, scores or the shares of students meeting the standard dropped going from fourth to fifth grade in math for the CST, although the share of students meeting the standard overall was a bit higher on the CST than it was on the Smarter Balance tests. So we're going to look at achievement for high needs students. So we saw that achievement for every group of students increased in the second year of testing, including for high needs students. So for economically disadvantaged students, the share of students meeting the standard increased by about 10 percentage points, which was even more than the average overall, and more than the amount of increase for non-economically disadvantaged students. So we saw their gap with their peers close a bit from 36 percentage points to 35 percentage points, which is an improvement, but still there's a substantial gap that will need to be addressed going forward. English learner results were not as good. Compared to the first year of Smarter Balance test to the second year of Smarter Balance test, the share of students meeting the standard among English learners in the English test increased by only about 2 percentage points. So they didn't tighten the gap with their English-only peers. In fact, the gap widened by about 6 percentage points. Now, part of these poor results are due to some of the features of the English learner program itself. English learner students are reclassified as fluent in English based in part on their scores on state standardized tests. So as students do better on these tests, they're actually reclassified as fluent, and they're taken out of this group of English learners that we saw did so poorly. We can see this when we look at the combined results for English learner students and reclassified English learners, and we see that their results were actually similar to the results that we saw for economically disadvantaged students. Now that's not as much of a coincidence as it seems, because about 3/4 of English learner students are also economically disadvantaged. So now we're going to shift from achievement to growth. Achievement is the share of students meeting the standard, while growth gives us a better sense of how scores are improving for all students. Achievement only shows how many students cross that threshold from not meeting to meeting the standard, while looking at, which is an important benchmark, but it leaves out a lot of important student progress. While when we look at growth, we can see how students did throughout the distribution. There are some students that may not have met the standard, but they saw very meaningful progress going from year 1 to year 2. And also some students that have not met the standard could also be seeing sort of lackluster progress, which is a bad sign that they may not be meeting the standard next year or in years to come. But before we get into looking at growth, we should talk a bit about the scores that we'll use to measure growth. So scores on the Smarter Balance test are called scale scores. They range from about 2,000 to 3,000 points. And there are cut points that show where students are relative to the standard, which is defined as demonstrating the skills necessary for success in future coursework. The scores are reported on what's called a vertical scale, which allows for comparisons of the scores both over time for individual students and across grade levels. We see that the cut points for the scores rise with each grade level. Specifically, looking at the threshold for meeting the standard in English, going from 4th to 5th grade, that threshold rises by about 29 points, which means a student would need to increase her score by about 29 points going from 4th to 5th grade in order to remain at the same achievement level. For math, that number is about 43 points. So when we looked at the results overall for the state of California, we see that on average, students averaged about 50 points of scale score growth in English and only about 31 points of scale score growth in math. And that 31 points is less than the 43 points they needed to meet the rising standards, so that's why we saw average achievement falling going from 4th to 5th grade in math. Looking at growth for high needs students, we saw that growth was substantial for economically disadvantaged students. It was at 50 points, the state average, which was just below their non-economically disadvantaged peers who were at 53 points. English learners also saw growth, although it was low relative to their peers. When we looked again at the combined results for English learner students and reclassified students, we saw that they had substantial growth, about 51 points of growth, which was even more than their English-only peers. But again, that's partly due to reclassification. When we looked in the second year, looking at this group of current English learners and reclassified English learners, that share of students that was reclassified in this group actually rose going from the first year to the second year. So in this group of current English learners and reclassified English learners, there were more reclassified students in the second year than in the first, so overall the group did a lot better. This is just another sign of how difficult it is to assess the results for English learner students without taking into account the role that reclassification plays in affecting these numbers. So we're going to shift from looking at growth alone to looking at the relationship between achievement and growth. Now, there's a lot going on here in this graph, so I'm going to take some time and run through it. So first, each of these blue dots represents one of the 600 districts that serve a significant number of fifth grade students. They're arrayed along the x-axis along achievement, and along the y-axis we have growth. These orange lines denote the averages of both measures. Vertically, we have about 50% of students meeting the standard, 50% achievement. And for growth, we have an average of 50 points of scale score growth. Now, when we look at this vertical line for achievement, we see that although all these districts on this line are about at 50% of their students meeting the standard, they vary widely in the amount of growth that they all saw. Some districts along this line had about 20 points of scale score growth on average, while others had almost 90. You can't see it on this graph, but in the report there are 4 boxes on each corner of the graph, which denotes the districts that fall into the top 20% of achievement and growth, showing those districts that were outliers on the 2 measures simultaneously. You can't see it here, but we ran a regression looking at these data, and we saw a positive relationship between achievement and growth, meaning that high achievement schools or high achievement districts also tended to be high growth, and vice versa, low achievement districts tended to be low growth. Now this signals an important problem, because as the districts that are lagging behind their peers, they're not seeing a lot of achievement. If they're also growing slowly, they're not making the progress that we need to see them catching up to their peers. Troublingly, when we look at a graph like this for high need students only, that positive relationship is even stronger, further signaling that problem of lagging districts falling further behind their peers could be even more serious. So when we looked at the state averages, it was just a list of 1 numbers. And when we look at the district averages, we can see much more variety in how districts vary along achievement and growth. The school results vary even more, and the individual student results vary even more than that. When we made a graph like this for the schools, it was actually literally covered in blue dots, just showing the amount of variation that when you're looking at achievement and growth at schools individually, they're literally all over the map. So looking at that variation, if we take those 4 corners and we look at comparing districts and schools that are both low achievement, low growth, low achievement, high growth, et cetera, we see that schools are much more varied. Looking at this first column for low achievement, low growth, we see that schools have a much higher share of students that are at low achievement, low growth schools. And that kind of hints that the results for individual students, the share of students that are low achievement and low growth simultaneously could be even higher. Now, those results are important because while it's true that there will always be some districts that are either low growth or low achievement, the extent to which some districts, schools, or students are both low achievement and low growth, that signals an important problem for the state's goals of closing achievement gaps. We really like to see the students and schools that are furthest behind making significant progress in order to catch up to their peers. So we've looked at achievement and growth separately, and we've even looked a bit at the relationship between achievement and growth. The state's new performance measure combines the two in order to provide a simple way to get a more holistic view of student progress, taking advantage of what you get from looking at achievement and also what you get from looking at growth. The new accountability system combines 2 measures, status, how students are doing now, and change, how students are doing relative to how they've done in previous years. Now, I'm saying status and change instead of achievement and growth because this measure applies to a variety of measures beyond just academics. This framework of status and change is applied to everything from graduation and suspension rates to college and career readiness, et cetera. The new measure combines status and change into a performance level, one of the 5 color-coded performance levels. Going from lowest to highest, we have the red level at the lowest, the orange level, and then the yellow, green, and the blue level at the highest. So when we look at performance for high-need students, when we look at performance levels across schools and districts, we see that there are more schools than districts at the extremes, at red and yellow, than there are for districts. Also, when we look at high-need students, performance is very closely related to the share of high-need students. There are districts and schools at very high performance levels tend to have also low shares of high-need students, and districts and schools at very low performance levels tend to have much higher shares of high-need students. So keep in mind, from the last chart, we saw that on average, blue districts are about 23% high need. However, as we saw in the graph before, or in the graph a few slides ago, individual district results can vary widely. We have some outliers. So although the average blue district is about 23% high need, we had some districts that were at the blue level but had much higher shares of high-need students. For example, we have Rosemead Elementary in Los Angeles and Savannah Elementary in Orange County that were at the blue level, but their shares of high-need students were much higher than the average for that level at about 86% and 77%. On the other end, some districts with much lower shares of high-need students were at performance levels that were much lower than predicted based on their demographics. We saw that 2 districts, Rancho Santa Fe and Spreckles Union, for example, their shares of high-need students were only 5% and 15% respectively, although they were at the yellow and orange performance levels, which on average students at that levels are about schools and districts at that levels were about on average 75% high need. Now, just to sort of as a sanity check, districts that exceeded expectations really excelled. They were at the blue performance level, the highest level there was. While on the other end, the districts that fell short from expectations were only really just below average. A district at the yellow level may not ring a lot of alarm bells, but if a district's peers, other districts with sort of similar shares of high-need students or similar student demographics, if those districts are consistently at the blue and green performance levels, then that difference could signal a problem. In the appendix of the report, we include lists of both the top and bottom 20 districts that are under and overperforming, and we also have lists of the top and bottom 50 schools that are over and underperforming. So looking back at those districts that overperformed expectations, we found that some have done exceptionally well for a number of years. Of the 20 districts that most exceeded expectations on the 2015-16 Smarter Balance tests, we saw that 5 of them also exceeded expectations on the test from the year before. Of those 5, 2 of them actually exceeded expectations again, going back 2 more years to the last administration of the CST, and we're in the top 20 again. As struggling districts with high shares of high-need students look for ways to help improve student performance, these districts that have been able to show a level of success that has been durable for multiple years and over even multiple tests could be a good place to look for best practices. So far we've mostly talked about districts, but we should note that the individual schools within a district can often vary as well. Looking at the 2 extremes, red schools and blue schools, we can see some of that variation. Now note, these are the extremes. Only about 19% of schools are either red or blue. But we can still see how school results vary widely from their districts. For example, for red schools, most red schools are in yellow districts. Only about 7% of red schools are also in red districts. On the other side, for blue schools, a lot more blue schools are also in blue districts, but again, the most common performance level of the districts for blue schools is actually green. When we looked at the results for all schools, we see that most schools were within about one performance level of their district. However, about 18% of schools were 2%, two or more performance levels away from their districts. Think red schools and yellow districts, for example. And just as an example of how strong a predictor the share of high needs students at a district or at a school is of performance, when we looked at those schools that were 2 levels below their districts, their share of high needs students was actually on average about 11 percentage points higher than the share of high needs students at the overall district. And in the reverse, when we looked at the schools that were 2 performance levels above their districts, the share of high needs students at those schools was actually about 20% lower than the share of high needs students at the overall district. This just shows some of the difficulties that districts and the state more generally are going to have as they try to make sure that academic success is more broadly shared and that we're seeing achievement gaps closing. So now we're going to talk a bit about looking ahead and what these results mean for California education going forward. So overall, California students did quite well on the second year of new tests. We're catching up with other states, and the early results have been much better on the new test than they were on the last time we had a new test, the CST, in the early 2000s. We saw there was a troubling connection between low achievement and low growth, and that will remain a focus going forward as we try to see achievement gaps close. High needs students saw improvements both in the number of students meeting the standard and in individual student growth, although those gains weren't enough to close achievement gaps with their non-disadvantaged peers. Interestingly, we also found that high needs students at districts with high shares of high needs students did about as well as high needs students at districts with lower shares of high needs students. Districts with high shares of high needs students receive additional extra funding to meet the challenges that arise from having a high concentration of high needs students. And the results here are showing that high needs students at those districts were doing just as well as high needs students at other districts with lower shares of high needs students is possibly a positive sign that that extra funding is doing its job of making sure that high needs students at these districts with high shares of high needs students aren't falling further behind due to the additional challenges that arise from having a high share of high needs students at a district or in the community more broadly. Perhaps not surprisingly, a key takeaway from these results is that high needs students and districts with high shares of high needs students will need more support going forward as they look to close achievement gaps. The state is in the process of developing resources to support those improvement efforts through things like the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, the CCEE, and other ways to help districts. Also, we saw that some of the districts that have had high success with high shares of high needs students could serve as a sort of source of examples or a place to look for best practices as these districts look to improve their results. Also, English learner results are important as well. With the change to the new tests, the state's reclassification policy is also in the process of being changed. And it'll be important for policymakers to keep in mind the difficulties that English learners have had with the new tests as they design new reclassification standards in order to make sure that the goal of reclassifying students when they're fluent in English is still met rather than pegging them to a new, harder standardized test. And I want to close with just by reiterating that test scores are an important metric of student performance, and it's important and useful for us to look at these results to see how students are doing. The state's new accountability system rightly takes into account a number of measures as well, and the broad array of measures that the state looks at helps give us a deeper perspective and a broader perspective on how the educational system is working in the wake of these new major reforms. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions, but please wait for the microphone to come to you.
Hi. You talked about the kind of high needs students at kind of large levels performing at the same standards as high need students in like lower concentration schools?
Yes.
And do you think that that could also kind of implicate that because if you have with the supplemental grants and concentration grants, there should be more funding that's being targeted to those students, that the students that are in schools with higher concentration should actually be outperforming their peers at schools with lower concentrations, and that might indicate that money's not being properly kind of targeted to those students?
Well, I guess it's an interpretive question. So it depends on, so the rationale to have concentration grants is that districts with high shares of these high need students have sort of additional challenges that arise from having a high concentration. And insofar as those challenges are significant, since these students are doing just as well as other students at less concentrated districts, if you look at it sort of optimistically, that could be a sign that the funding, that extra funding is working to keep these students from falling further behind.
I was wondering if the dropout rate affects the scores for 11th graders. In other words, if they drop out before they get to 11th grade and they're some of the low scoring students, it seems like it would bump it up.
Yeah, that could be part of it. One thing that the state has done for sort of high grade students, we recently moved away from having a statewide exit exam. And there's been a push either to not replace it and use the last year of the Smarter Balance test, the 11th grade Smarter Balance test scores as a replacement. And that issue with dropping out had been an issue with the exit exam, and it could possibly be a continuing issue as we use the 11th grade Smarter Balance test for the same purpose.
You criteria English as a priority. I'm hearing mathematics. How is that relating in regard to this new testing procedures?
So looking at, we spent a lot of time looking at the relationship between achievement and growth, although we were focused on the English scores. In our analysis, when we looked at achievement and growth for math, a lot of those relationships were similar. We saw that positive relationship between achievement and growth where low achievement districts were also low growth and falling further behind. The results are generally the same when we look at English and math, although the main difference is that across the board, the share of students meeting the standard is much lower in math compared to English, at least for 4th and 5th grade students. Question in the back. Oh, hold on, can you wait for a microphone? Thank you.
Thanks. The data that you were looking at in terms of gap closure was really much focused on the 4th to 5th grade years, and I'm wondering, as you looked across the data statewide and gap closure, were there other patterns that emerged outside of that grade span?
So when we picked the 4th to 5th grade cohort, we had those reasons for picking it, but just to sort of make sure it wasn't abnormal, this 4th to 5th grade cohort, we also looked at results for the 7th and 8th grade cohort. And it's similar to the difference between English and math. Overall, lower shares of students met the standard in the 7th and 8th grade, although the amount of growth they saw was about the same as the 4th to 5th grade cohort. Yeah. Good question.
In the study, did you make any connections or sort of in terms of data around early learning? So the influence on early, preschool, et cetera, as as the child sort of goes through the regular school system. Was there any information to that point?
We didn't take into account sort of differences in access to early childhood education across students, but part of why we focused on the results for students in the early years in the 4th and 5th grades was that a lot of educational research shows that early academic progress is a key sort of determinant of students' future outcomes. So the results that students see in the 4th and 5th grades, for example, are really crucial as a really crucial indicator of how they're going to do going forward, in graduating and college success and things like that. So it's important for us to, in these first couple of years of the new tests, to see how students are doing, and in particular, how younger students are doing, because how they're doing now is a key sign of how they're going to do in the future.
I was just wondering on the outliers, did you notice any trend related to whether the high need was based on English learner status or socioeconomically disadvantaged?
We didn't
Whether that
look
influenced it?
that closely into it, although one important thing to note is that as far as the distinction between English learner students and high needs and economically disadvantaged students, English learner students are almost overwhelmingly also economically disadvantaged. About 75% of English learner students are also low income or economically disadvantaged. If that's all, thank you very much. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Sorry about that.
I was chatting here. So thanks for your work on this. For you, what questions emerged from doing this that you didn't have the time or resources to look into that you would have liked to have?
I think the biggest question was when we looked at these outliers, districts that had really high shares of high needs students but managed to perform exceptionally well. There's the question, sort of your first question is why? We saw that the share of high needs students at a district is a key determinant. It's really sort of strongly related to how districts perform, although in these sort of abnormal cases where districts have high shares of high needs students and they're able to still perform at a very high level, you assume there must be something about them, and we didn't have a chance to look at what it was about those districts that led them to excel at such a high level. Well, if that's all, thank you very much, everyone, for coming.